Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka No Justice MTG, and tonight I am delighted to be joined by Kieran Andrieu. Kieran, first question. What was it like when you first stepped off the boat and realised you were under the hands of a genocidal military?
It was a jumble of emotions that were pretty difficult to process at that exact moment, and I'm still processing them now. But it was, I suppose, pretty scary, you could say. I think the moment when we realised that shit had hit the fan and that the light interception, so-called, despite it being an illegal kidnapping in international waters, was actually in many ways a ploy to lull us into a false sense of security, was exactly that moment when we got to the port of Ashdod and I saw 300 or so flotilla comrades lined up with their hands bound behind their backs, face down at the tarmac, and then I was grabbed by the scruff of my neck and thrown down on the floor. So I suppose you could say it was pretty scary, it was pretty intimidating, and that was not by accident.
Well, you are certainly a braver comrade than I. Make sure that you stick with us tonight, because at the end of the show, Kieran will be answering your questions about the flotilla, as well as his experience at the hands of his Israeli captors. You can put those questions in the chat throughout the show, and we'll put them to Kieran later on. Before that, though, Rachel Reeves is under pressure to raise income tax in the upcoming autumn budget, and Paul Holden defends his damning exposé of Keir Starmer's Labour on Politics Live. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support as always, and you can obviously let us know your comments in the super chat or indeed tweet at us on the hashtag NovaraLive. The Donald Trump brokered ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was always going to be incredibly fragile, but today cracks have already begun to show. The Israeli military has killed 5 Palestinians in northern Gaza after Israel says they entered the Israeli-controlled zone beyond the so-called Yellow Line. A 6th man has been reported killed by drone fire in Khan Yunis. The Yellow Line is the area beyond which the Israeli military has now retreated, following the exchange of hostages held by both sides yesterday. Obviously, it's not a physical line marked out in Gaza, and many Palestinians are eager to return to what's left of their homes beyond it. Both Hamas and Israel have today been returning the bodies of captors who've died in their respective captivities. The bodies of 45 Palestinians have arrived in Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, where they'll undergo autopsies to determine their cause of death. This is only the first batch of remains due to be returned to Gaza from Israeli detention centres, where hundreds of the bodies of Palestinians killed since October the 7th are still held. Meanwhile, Israel has said it has identified the remains of 4 Israeli captives held by Hamas. 2 have been named as 26-year-old Israeli Guy Ilutz and Bipin Joshi, a 22-year-old Nepalese citizen. There remain a further 20 bodies of Israeli prisoners to be returned to Israel, but Hamas had already warned during the ceasefire negotiations that the destroyed state of Gaza make their recovery more difficult. And today, the International Committee of the Red Cross agreed, calling the task of recovering the bodies a massive challenge, and saying some may never be found at all. In Gaza City, bulldozers have begun the slow task of clearing the rubble that doubtlessly conceals the bodies of at least some of those 20 hostages, as well as thousands of Palestinians. According to some estimates, the enclave now lies under 60 million tons of rubble, with the UN estimating up to 15 years to clear it. Israel, however, is working on a much shorter time frame. According to Israeli media, Israel has given Hamas until the end of Tuesday, that's today if you're watching live, to make further progress on returning the bodies, with ministers accusing Hamas of deliberately holding some of them back. And writing on X on Monday, Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz suggested any delays could jeopardize the ceasefire process, saying this: "The urgent mission to which we are all committed now is to ensure the return of all the abducted bodies home. Hamas's announcement about the expected return of 4 bodies today is a failure to meet commitments. Any delay or deliberate avoidance will be considered a gross violation of the agreement and will be responded to accordingly." Hamas has said it will return a further 4 bodies to Israel later tonight. Kieran, about Israel Katz's statement there, I mean, we should be surprised, but of course this isn't surprising. Or what do you make of what he said there?
Well, I think, first thing I want to emphasize is that this, unfortunately, was always predictable. The status quo as of today was, to my mind, and I think to many Palestinians and many analysts, this was always where we were going to get to. I am a little bit shocked at how quickly we've got there, but I am not shocked by the substance of today's events. So, what do I mean by that? I think that Israel's strategy now is death by 1,000 cuts, which is to say a trickle compared to where we were a week ago, or indeed for the past 2 years, typically. A trickle of the murders and bombings and so on that we've become accustomed to seeing, and that people in Gaza have become accustomed to living with. But there will still be a steady amount of violence, a steady amount of death, Palestinians being shot, and the pretexts will always be based on these, a kind of roll call of false concepts. For example, the yellow line. Palestinians crossed the yellow line today, and they approached the yellow line, and that violates the terms of the ceasefire. Well, the terms of the ceasefire were not agreed in any significant degree by Palestinians. And things like the yellow line, these are totally arbitrary constructs within international law. The actual boundaries of international law have not been respected or even acknowledged in this entire process. So I think, in view of what Israel Katz said, but he is speaking a wider truth among the Israeli political class, which is that I think the plan was to always scupper this ceasefire by setting, first of all, unachievable targets and applying unachievable criteria, and then blaming Hamas or blaming the Palestinians when they are unable to meet those terms that they had no hand in negotiating. And the only question for me, really, is to what degree is Trump in on this strategy of Israel's? To what degree did Trump has Trump staked his reputation on this ceasefire holding? Because we know he's obviously a very narcissistic person. So it is plausible that Trump actually wants this ceasefire to work, not because he gives a shit about Palestinian or even Israeli life, but because he cares about being the peacemaker and winning his Nobel Prize. So, but in that scenario, you would assume that the Israelis are doing this, pushing the envelope with Trump as well as everybody else to see how far they can push it before he reacts and reins them in. I think actually more plausible is probably that this is part of a strategy that they have all agreed, which is the formal ceasefire stands, but de facto Palestinians are still killed in, a trickle or whatever, day by day, death by 1,000 cuts, until something happens and full scale, wholesale death and destruction resumes, and then it will be Hamas's fault. Unfortunately, that's where I think we are.
While the Israeli war machine may have stalled for now, its propaganda units appear to be operating on full throttle. During the hostage exchanges yesterday, multiple high-profile ex-accounts all appeared to post variants of the same observation regarding female hostages that were held by Hamas. This was from high-profile right-wing conspiracy theorist Laura Loomer. All of the female hostages are dead. Where is the outrage? Savages. Loomer repeated that accusation in this interaction with Katie Miller, the wife of Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. Because Islam is a death cult and Hamas raped and murdered all of them, it is time for Trump admin to crack down on Islam. We cannot allow for this death cult to destroy our country and rape and kill our women here in the United States too. This is Islam, pure barbarism. And this is a response to a tweet by Katie Miller asking why there aren't any living female hostages. In Britain, former Olympic swimmer turned right-wing commentator Sharon Davis had the same thought, saying this: "Hostages didn't die, they were murdered. Big difference. I can't think of a word horrific enough to explain how no female hostages made it out. None." There's just a handful of the many similar and sometimes identical posts published by right-wing accounts with large followings. Now, it goes without saying that it's all a lot of rubbish. Of the bodies remaining in Gaza, one is thought to belong to a woman, Inbar Hayman, who is thought to have been killed while in captivity in the weeks following October the 7th. In actual fact, women captors were prioritized for early release. Of the almost 90 women taken hostage on October the 7th, 77 were returned alive to Israel, mostly in ceasefire exchanges. The bodies of 11 others, either killed on October the 7th or while in Hamas captivity, have also been returned to Israel. Kieran, what does it make of the Zionist propaganda machine that they all seem to have conveniently forgotten about all of the female hostages that were exchanged in previous hostage exchange agreements?
It speaks to, I mean, it's sensible if what you're interested in is Zionist propaganda, right? Because I think from the very beginning of this genocide, and indeed way before the genocide, one of the handiest kind of lightning rods in everything that's happened around Gaza for the past 15, 20 years has been that Hamas could be said to be an Islamist organization. And, you know, there has been so much evidence of people ascribing blame by association to the people of Gaza and justifying their destruction on the basis that they elected not just a government that, you know, has engaged in terroristic or violent acts, but also that it's an Islamist organization. As Israel likes to often say, falsely, of course, Hamas is ISIS and vice versa. And so I think basically since 9/11 and indeed before 9/11, there has been an enormous whirlpool, an enormous reservoir of fear around the Islamist influence in Western politics. And so referring to Hamas in that context and continually trying to draw the link between Palestinians generally, not just in Gaza, Palestinians generally, and the Palestinian political class as well, drawing the link between that and Islamism is, if what you're interested in is Zionist propaganda and kind of advancing Israel's agenda, then it's very effective. It makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, it's very easy for right-wing commentators to latch onto that. It's a kind of virtuous cycle for them and Zionists. It suits their narratives as well. So, yeah, it makes perfect sense, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. It's really easy to do scare propaganda by trying to link what Hamas or PIJ have been doing with a broader Islamist context in throughout what we've been dealing with, for example, for the war on terror for the last kind of 25, 30 years or so, conveniently forgetting that the main cause that Hamas and PIJ subscribe to is Palestinian nationalism. It is the fundamental basis of the material reality of the occupation that caused these groups to come into being and to engaging in the acts they do, not to make terrorist acts defensible. But that's the material reality there. They're not like, for example, other Islamist organizations are doing, wanting to expand a broader caliphate or whatever. This is specifically about the return of those to the homelands that they were ethnically cleansed from during the Nakba. But of course, a lot of the Zionists want you to think that the Nakba was just people leaving because the Arab armies told them to, and not indeed what it actually was. In the most part, was a deliberate ethnic cleansing campaign at gunpoint to expel Palestinians from their territory, as was laid out by the colonial Zionist thinkers of the 1800s and the early 1900s. The autumn budget is just over a month away, and the Chancellor's office has been briefing constantly to test the waters on what they may or may not be able to get away with to deal with the UK's precarious fiscal position. Earlier this year, a report by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research identified a gaping £40 billion shortfall in the projected tax take between now and 2029 for Rachel Reeves to stick to her self-imposed fiscal rules. And that's just to maintain the current level of service provision. The NIESR came out recently to suggest that Reeves should look at raising the rate of income tax as the best way of being able to raise the funds necessary with the fewest drawbacks. Now, this has some major problems, though. The first being that the Labour manifesto explicitly ruled out any raising of the rates of the big three taxes: income tax, VAT and national insurance on employees. That's taxes on working people, as they put it. So taking this advice would violate a manifesto commitment. And even if they hadn't ruled it out pre-election, it would be very difficult for them to get away with it politically, given the high salience of the cost of living crisis as a concern for voters. It far outstrips any other issues for voters by almost double the next highest concerns of the NHS and immigration. And an income tax increase when household budgets are already stretched would go down like a lead balloon with the public. Now, it is worth noting that there is actually some level of public support for an income tax increase that specifically targets higher earners. Now, that's quite a high support. But the problem comes with communicating such a policy to the public, who famously don't have quite got a grip of what constitutes a high earner. Labour went into the 2019 election with a very reasonable proposal of an income tax increase on those earning over £80,000 a year. At the time, that was the top 5%, which led to a very infamous moment on Question Time when a man in the audience berated Richard Bergen over the policy, assuming that he himself was below the median wage whilst earning 80k a year, a figure which is actually in reality, at the time, more than double the median wage. So Reeves' hands are tied. Where else can she look? An overwhelming consensus shared by most experts, such as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but also by MPs and basically any citizen who isn't loaded up with property wealth, is to look at much-needed council tax reform, a way of making the system fairer between the North and the South and being able to smuggle large tax increases into a large-scale overhaul of the system at the same time. Property valuations for council tax haven't been revised in over 30 years, meaning the tax bands make no sense when linked to house prices now, which have grown significantly more in the southeast and in London as they have in the north. So an update of council tax bands and a rejigging of council tax block grants to compensate could ease cost of living pressures for neglected northern towns by hiking taxes on richer London boroughs, and that can only be a good thing in my book, given the regional inequality problems this country has. One thing that has seen widespread public support is the idea of a wealth tax. This is currently Green Party policy and could fill a huge chunk of the hole Reeves is looking to fill, something which Labour have been ruling out for some time. But it's now gaining at least some support in some unexpected places. Now even the centre-right Institute for Fiscal Studies is at least on board to some extent. Now, they don't support the idea of an annual wealth tax, as the Green Party do, but they have suggested a one-off surprise levy to catch asset owners before they have a chance to offshore their holdings. The IFS have also suggested a couple of other minor tweaks that could, in my personal opinion, make a lot of sense, such as ending inheritance tax relief on capital gains tax and increasing the bank levy and bank surcharge. Banks could certainly cough up a little bit more, in my opinion. One thing is for certain, however, tax rises are inevitable. The question, of course, is how will Labour sell this to the public? Remember, they said that there were going to be no more big tax rises after last year's budget, so they need a good reason. Now, it seems like in yet another U-turn to appeal to a voter group they're losing to their inability to find a lane and stick to it, they're trying to win back Remainers by blaming Brexit for the current economic problems of the UK. According to Stephen Swinford from The Times, Starmer is set to use this as a line to demarcate the government from its major opposition in Farage and Badenoch, who both backed Brexit. One of the central problems plaguing the UK economy is almost 2 decades of sluggish productivity growth, which is an intractable and multifaceted problem that can't really be blamed on one person or one singular cause, especially since the issue preceded Brexit. Not that will stop Labour from blaming it, though. Swinford reports this is in relation to a downgrade in the economic forecast from the OBR. Starmer and Reeves are expected to argue that, if it hadn't been for Brexit, this type of downgrade would have not been needed, and to cite official figures suggesting that if Britain had not left the European Union, the economy would be about £120 billion bigger by 2035 than current forecasts suggest it will be. The message is simple. Farage is ultimately to blame as the man who delivered Brexit with easy sloganeering, then walked away from the aftermath rather than putting it in the hard yards. Or, to put it another way, Farage, not us, is responsible for putting up your taxes. Now, fundamentally, Farage was never in government, although he was definitely a big face of the Vote Leave campaign. And certainly, it does seem a little bit weird that before Brexit happened, he was all about a Norway-style deal, and then it was all about no deal, and now we're in this mess. But the reality, of course, is that the person who was supposed to be doing the post-Brexit trade deals was Kemi Badenoch, who was at one point the Business and Trade Secretary. So it does seem a little bit odd that Farage has taken the flak for what is really a Conservative Party problem, although given that Farage is seen as Mr. Brexit, the public will mind too much. The reality, of course, is, who is this for? The Remain-Leave divide in terms of where our political consciousness is as a country at the moment, that's not where we are, right? The cost of living crisis is really biting, and there's an inequality crisis here. And whilst there is plenty to say about the harms of Brexit, which we'll come to in a second, the idea that this is going to be a convenient excuse to get away with the fact that, in reality, taxes are just too low in this country. And if we really want to have the kind of public services that they enjoy in Western Europe, we're going to have to take our overall tax take and public spending as a percentage of GDP to a similar level, where we are currently under the median tax take as a percentage of GDP, and indeed public spending as a percentage of GDP, than our European neighbours such as France, Germany, and Nordic countries. So I think that if they'd have been honest before the election, they wouldn't have to worry. They could have just said, taxes are too low, let's raise them to get better public services. But they have to keep doing this dance where they just fail to actually name the core issue, which is that we've taxed ourselves for too low for too long. Now, here's how the Daily Express's Christian Calgi comment responded to this idea on Jeremy Vine today.
Let's be very clear. The economy's not been going well. There's been a cost of living crisis. But one of the problems for both of us is disentangling what was Brexit and what were the other two once-in-a-generation crises that happened pretty much at exactly the same time, namely COVID and the war in Ukraine and the subsequent energy crisis. So there's a whole bundle, right? And it's very difficult to disentangle. All countries are facing economic growth sluggishness, energy cost crises, food cost crises. I don't accept that Brexit was a terrible disaster, or certainly something that can't be mitigated by clever domestic economic policies.
Personally, I'm certainly at the very least a little bit sympathetic to this idea that especially the real Romaniacs of this world will blame Brexit for literally everything when there was a real kind of omni-crisis in terms of the entropic nature of the economy at the moment. But the idea that you can just kind of ignore it and ignore at least the things that it has contributed to, or the fact that it's made a bunch of these omni-crises much worse, I think that seems like Brexiteer denial to me from Christian Calgi there, right? Like, for example, if we're having a problem with food prices because of climate change and grain imports from Ukraine, we already import a lot of our food. Increasing trade barriers with countries that are very close to us that we import a lot of food from is going to increase food prices. That's one of the biggest sources of inflation, of core inflation, that's been part of the actual feeling that people have of the cost of living crisis, which is more important than the raw numbers, right? The Vimes Boots Index, this idea that the poor people will feel inflation hardest because even if it's smaller amongst the bottom end of the economy, those prices are relatively higher for those people. Food imports is one of those things. Likewise is true of the energy crisis that he points out there, also because of the COVID backlog and indeed because of the war in Ukraine. Fundamentally, one of the places that we are most likely to import things from is from Europe when it comes to energy too, or being part of a larger energy agreement in terms of getting better access to Norwegian gas, which the European Union has been able to negotiate. Now, we don't have access to these things because of Brexit. Now, it may be a secondary effect that has magnified other crises, but it still means that at least it's some point to blame. Although what I will say is that when he talks about clever domestic policy, he's right. The problem, of course, is that right-wingers like him actually don't have any solutions. There were some benefits to Brexit in terms of being able to take over our own monetary sovereignty. In 2017, if Jeremy Corbyn had won the general election, we could have been using our access to, for example, monetary financing of government deficits, i.e. selling bonds directly to the Bank of England, which is banned under the Lisbon Treaty, to be able to do what's called the people's quantitative easing, using new money, essentially, through QE, putting straight into the economy, either helicopter money in the hands of working people through things like economic stimulus, like you saw in America during the COVID pandemic, or directly into investment into new cooperative businesses, new things like council housing construction, which would have really gotten us out of the liquidity trap that had been manifested for so long by George Osborne's austerity economics. A liquidity trap, for people who don't know, is when investment essentially doesn't happen even if you reduce interest rates to zero, which is where we were. Interest rates were really low and no one was still investing. So we should have forced investment by using the state access to monetary financing of government deficits that Brexit would have given us. It also would have allowed us to be able to not have to deal with as much competition law that the European Union restricts us with, to be able to have the state have more of a role in the economy, like you see over there in China, where they seem to be doing pretty well out of the pandemic economically. But alas, right-wingers like Christian Calgi, or indeed anyone who's had access to the reins of power since Brexit happened, was never going to actually do that. We really need to elect it before we really needed to elect Jeremy Corbyn to implement those policies in 2017 before interest rates normalised after the pandemic was over. Kieran, given everything we've heard there, do you think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will get away with just blaming Brexit for all the problems, or will people just see through the facade?
Any question whose answer isn't tax rises, whether it's a higher end of income tax or for higher earners, or wealth tax, and there are an array of wealth taxes that can be employed and applied. And you touched on some of them, Helena, but or broad-based wealth tax as well is another way of tackling it. But I would favour more segmented wealth taxes. One of those would be, land. Any any question whose answer isn't that is the wrong question. And it's interesting. I mean, you said your way of articulating it, Helena, was who is this for? And I think that's a very important question. I suspect that Keir Starmer doesn't do anything, his government doesn't do anything unless it's had intense focus grouping. And so we can assume that some of that focus grouping and maybe some of the statisticians that he has working for him have told him that strategically a marginal majority now would favour returning to the European Union or regrets having left or whatever it might be, whatever the question asked might be. I can't really see, I mean, between 2016 and the 2019 election, there was so much speculation about where the general public was on Brexit that we heard from so many pro-Remain quarters that people were having regret, as it was called, an awful linguistic innovation. But you would think that was certainly objective truth, because everywhere you turned, in mainstream quarters at least, barring the kind of more tabloidy or right-wing press, everybody was insisting that the country had now seen the error of its ways and that everybody wants to rejoin the European Union. And lo and behold, the 2019 election, I think, settled that question pretty decisively. So I am seriously not convinced of the politics and of the sort of electoral strategy that one assumes is behind blaming Brexit for everything. But just to return to the economics for a moment, there's no solution here. And if you take the longer view, which I think we should, and we've discussed this on shows before, Helena, the entire economic model that our country uses, that it day to day bases its productive output on, is completely and utterly flawed. And that's not unique to the UK, although the UK obviously has unique structural problems, as does every country in the G20. But every country in the G20 has been more or less growing sluggishly over the past 20 years. It's true that not every country in the G20 has low productivity. Famously, the United States has, I mean, it's been in fits and starts, but much higher productivity than the UK, Germany as well. But even productivity is not a silver bullet. One thing that's often underappreciated, I think, is that high productivity and, high employment and low productivity often go together because of the composition of the economy when you have typically speaking, when you have high employment rates in a country. So it's not a silver bullet to have high productivity, but what we absolutely need in our country and across the G20, but let's focus on the UK, is a revision of industrial relations. But to bring it more immediately back to what we're discussing here, we need to reform the tax codes and we need to reform the tax system. It's a complete nonsense to focus on anything else. The country is in desperate need of money. Public services are in desperate need of money. And there has been a complete shift in the places where wealth is accrued, if you want to put it like that, over the past 30, 40 years. And the sort of overlapping or imbricating political and economic system that we have in the UK means that we are not able to get to that wealth. We're not able to get to that money. We're not able to raise it. Not for economic reasons, for political reasons. That needs to change. As I say, wealth taxes, taxes on income at the highest end of earners. These are things that either I don't want to say socialism or barbarism. That's a bit extreme in this context. But either those questions are seriously tackled at some juncture in the near future, or our country and its public services and the fabric of its society, dare I say, if that's not too pretentious, will continue to unravel at quite an alarming pace, and managed to decline will become less easily managed.
That's it, right? Like, it's the same story all across Europe. And I think one thing that our country can't come to terms with is the fact that we have a real aging society, right? We talk about the ballooning welfare bill so often in the political discussion in this country without mentioning that the biggest part of our ballooning welfare bill is the state pension. And I believe in having a good state pension. I think it's good that it's maintained the fact that it's non-means tested for so long. But if this wants to continue, because it will continue to increase and increase higher than inflation in most years, right, is that we actually do need to look at raising taxes to do that, and indeed having more working age people to be able to ensure we have the tax base to support it. Otherwise, have a lopsided tax base to retiree ratio in terms of working people. Because, for example, if we cut down migration, that will lead to fewer taxpayers for the retired who are entirely reliant on the state in most cases. Tax burden is going up in other those the tax burden is increasing in all those other European countries with aging demographics too. And if we don't do the same, and if we don't admit that that is going to have to happen as a country, then we'll just continually having to cut like we did during the 2010s, and that will get us nowhere. Investigative journalist Paul Holden has caused quite a stir in Keir Starmer's Politburo. His new book, The Fraud, that chronicles the duplicitous rise to power of the Labour leader, has already led to the resignation of Paul Ovenden from Starmer's top team and reignited the discussion around the funding of the Starmer-supporting dark money-backed think tank Labour Together. It's well known now that Labour Together, then headed by Starmer Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney, failed to declare £700,000 of donations and was fined by the Electoral Commission over it. But Holden expands in his book on how that money was used behind the scenes to prepare for Starmer to be Corbyn's heir apparent. Here he is discussing this on yesterday's Politics Live.
And that money is not just incidental. This is not an incidental to the story. That was money that was then used to fundamentally transform our politics. Because on the one hand, Morgan McSweeney was using that money to pay for polling, to incubate the leadership of Keir Starmer. At the same time, he was running what I think is a rather despicable campaign, entirely secret, without any disclosure at all in the public, destroying the Labour Party from within to make sure that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn couldn't win the 2019 general election, or with a pot of money that's not being declared. Now, I raise issues with that because I don't think even though the Electoral Commission has made a finding there, I don't feel that story is over, because I have serious questions, serious reservations about whether those donations were not reported purposefully. And in fact, I make an argument in my book.
Because Morgan McSweeney, they say that Labour Together have said that they were an administrative error.
Which on the face of the evidence really makes no sense to me. And I'll give you an example, if I may. It was back in 2023, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Electoral Commission, and they provided me with all the correspondence between Mr. Morgan McSweeney and the Electoral Commission. And it shows that in November 2017, Morgan McSweeney called the Electoral Commission and said, I don't think we should report donations. I don't want to report donations. We're not a campaigning organisation. And the Electoral Commission wrote back to him on multiple occasions and said, no, you have an absolute duty to report donations. It's absolutely clear that Morgan McSweeney was told over the course of a number of months of his duty to report donations and how to report those donations.
Now, is it any wonder why a bunch of donations from billionaires, from hedge funders, from business tycoons, and from Israeli lobbyists, he might want to hide potentially? And again, I'm not saying this is what was being done, but you can see the rationale, if that was the case, for wanting to ensure people didn't know who he was getting his money from, to ensure that people realised the kind of people who'd back that campaign. It's really important to understand that people don't donate to political causes and political parties, especially from the business community, if they don't think they're going to get ROI, right? Like, there's a reason that during the Corbyn era of leadership within Labour, the broader Labour Party didn't really receive huge donations from those kinds of people. They were specifically pouring money into a group that was there to oppose what Jeremy Corbyn stood for, fundamentally because that is the oppositional nature of the Labour movement and capital. Like, rich people represent capital, and everybody else who is the ones who are being paid Labour wages by capital, they have a conflicting relationship. There would be no reason for the rich to fund a political party that fundamentally stands in opposition to the rich. So you'd want to get rid of someone like Corbyn who held those policy positions. Again, I'm not saying this is what happened, right? Of course, there'd be no evidence for this. But this would be something that would be likely, in my mind, to be a material interest that they would have to not donate, to not declare that funding. Now, on the panel with him was Labour MP for Milton Keynes Central, Emily Darlington. This is how she responded.
I mean, it wasn't much of a secretive organisation. Everybody knew about it at the time.
That's not true.
I was a member. I wasn't affiliated. No, I was a member of the Labour Party.
Okay, so did you know what Labour Together was doing behind the scenes?
No, but I knew about
so it was
them.
secret to
I also knew about there were different organisations around. Unions 21 was around.
Okay, but
still
what did you
then.
think Labour Together was doing
We
at
had
the
the
time?
Labour left.
What do you think Labour Together was doing between 2017 and 2020?
So-
what did you know about?
What I knew about was I had a party that I had supported.
That's not the question I'm asking.
Hang on, you're asking me what my recollection in 2017 was.
Of what
so
Labour Together was doing.
I knew of them. That's all I knew.
Okay.
I wasn't involved with them. But what I did know was my party was spiraling down. It had anti-Semitism happening. It had intolerance of any view that wasn't within the Corbyn little sphere. It was not nice to be a member of the party at the time, and it was unelectable. And I worked my butt off locally in Milton Keynes, making sure that we had policies in Milton Keynes so we could lead the council and then hopefully prepare for government, which we've now done.
Now, again, trying to bring up the anti-Semitism stuff as if it's like received wisdom, when we all now know the reality. Anushka Astana did a really great expose on the reality, which was that a lot of these anti-Semitism things were deliberately leaked to the press from unaffiliated Facebook groups as examples of Labour anti-Semitism by people connected to Morgan McSweeney specifically. And when you looked at the overall internal polling about who agreed with anti-Semitic statements, there was far more anti-Semitism, according to those statistics, within the Conservative Party and within UKIP than there was within Labour at the time, who are very low in terms of their overall anti-Semitism. So the idea that we can just continue to accept that this was an anti-Semitic party when clearly it wasn't, I don't know how they still get away with it. When it comes to the idea of Corbyn not tolerating views outside of what he believed, the temerity, like the barefaced cheek, when Corbyn was the one who was appointing people from the Labour right to his shadow cabinet in opposition to try and build the so-called unity that Keir Starmer claims to believe in the run-up to the leadership election and still claims to believe in, is ridiculous. When there was no purge, there was no Stalinism, there was no excising of Labour right members of neither the PLP nor the membership during the time when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. But under Keir Starmer, that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened. He literally openly said, right, if you don't like the fact that I've changed the party and made it unrecognisable, you can leave. They purged people from the party, Jewish people from the party, on completely vexatious, in my mind, claims of anti-Semitism, which seems kind of prima facie ridiculous. It's Keir Starmer and the Labour right and Morgan McSweeney and their little Politburo. They were the intolerant ones. They were the ones who got rid of people for completely spurious reasons. And it was Corbyn who tried to unify the party. This is a complete rewriting of history. Now, Paul Holden was understandably not impressed with her non-answer to the question at hand, and he pushed her further on Labour Together's alleged wrecking campaign.
It doesn't disturb you at all that they were running a 2.5-year campaign to make sure the Labour Party lost under Jeremy Corbyn, a Labour Party that you were part of. You don't think that's a problem?
So we are used to having those campaigns in the Labour Party. Momentum, again, that was an organisation that was set up to bring Jeremy Corbyn to power.
Who were declaring publicly their funding, they were declaring with the law and what they were doing,
this is where,
and Labour Together was not.
This is where I agree with you. Everyone should declare publicly their funding. And we need more transparency in campaign finance. And so it's not just my challenge to reform and not just my challenge to Labour. We have a huge gap in our electoral system where electoral law does not apply to social media and to online platforms. And we need to be closing that. Neither Electoral Commission has no responsibility for the online space, and the Online Safety Act has no responsibility for electoral law. And we need to close that. I think, absolutely. I think transparency and closing that loop is so important.
You have to act like it's important. Because what you have right now is a Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister who broke the law. We know he broke the law. He's found guilty of breaking the law. And nobody seems in the Labour Party to care about that. At the same time, Labour Together's directors were Steve Reid, a cabinet minister, Lisa Nandy, a cabinet minister. That organisation broke the law for 2.5 years. Why do you not care about that fact?
It's incredible, really, to try and compare Momentum to Labour Together when Momentum at no point, at any point, even in the kind of post-Corbyn Momentum in exile days, where they're a pretty toothless organisation, at no point have they ever tried to deliberately tank any election campaigns. At no point have they, outside of being oppositional in terms of ideology, decided to try and undermine the Labour Party kind of broadly, Because that's what was being done. The people within Labour together, Morgan McSweeney was explicit, and according to Anushka Astana anyway, at saying that the worst possible situation for them was a Corbyn administration, right? We know from the Ford report about the Ergen House arrangement. We know full well about the kind of reactions people on the Labour right had when they found out that they'd achieved a hung parliament in 2017. And they weren't happy because they realised that it would keep Corbyn in the leadership position at the same time, right? And it's, again, so interesting to watch her continue to avoid the question about the reality of what she knew about Labour together and just go, oh, it was just a campaigning organisation. We all knew it was there. Well, it was obviously they were lying. They started off by saying that they were about Labour unity, when we now know from all of the information we have from Paul Holden, from Martin Ford, everything that we know internally from the Labour files, and all of the different kind of piecemeal information that we've managed to get together about the reality of what was happening in the background between 2017 and 2020 to try and hoodwink the membership through the lies that Keir Starmer told during the election campaign, having tanked the election campaigns in 2017 and 2019 to get to that point. And she can't even muster up the ability to even condemn what has happened, where these people have been found to have broken electoral law. Again, it just shows you that principle is something that doesn't belong in the current Labour Party. They can't find themselves the spine or the sincerity to at least stand on some level of principle, to condemn what had happened and to at least acknowledge the reality rather than pivoting to, well, Corbyn was unelectable. That may be the case. It may be the case that even if there wasn't an Ergen House arrangement, it may have been the case that without the internal alleged wrecking campaign, Corbyn would still have lost in 2017. I'm perfectly willing to accept that fact, right? But we can't know that until it's tested in a vacuum. And unfortunately, trying to win an election whilst your own members from the right of your party are trying to deliberately tank the election is not a vacuum with which to test that hypothesis. Kieran, what have you made so far of Paul Holden's revelations? And what did you make of Emily Darlington's response?
Well, sometimes the topics on these shows are like pieces of a puzzle, and you put them together one by one. And actually, this speaks to the previous topic we covered. Why is it that Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, and the whole shebang will ask every wrong question? Well, it's partly, I'm not saying it's solely, but it's partly because of the kind of thing that these revelations show us, which is that from the very beginning, before the very beginning, Keir Starmer has been, and his people have been in the pockets of big business, of capital, of the people who do not want taxes to rise, either on wealth or on incomes, but principally on wealth and assets. And they don't want a fundamentally different political economy. They don't want different industrial relations. This works pretty well. A lot of this works pretty well for them. And if they do want changes, it's in the opposite direction. A direction that doesn't favour the general public and favours their interests, rather. So I think, as I say, pieces of a puzzle. They're not unrelated. That's the first thing. And also, just an obvious contradiction about what the Labour MP was saying just there, which is she's there saying that the Labour Party between 2015 and 2019, but particularly in 2017 onwards, was a kind of Stalinist operation. And then, on the other hand, she's acknowledging this organisation within the Labour Party that didn't even declare its finances and then comparing it to Momentum and accepting that Momentum did declare its finances. So, I mean, it doesn't sound like a very successful Stalinist operation to me for there to be a Labour Together or any other group that's trying to actively fell the leadership. And that brings me to, I think, an undeniable point. Jeremy Corbyn, God love him, and I do love him, his biggest flaw as leader of the Labour Party was that he was not authoritarian enough. And that isn't to say that I think people should, the Labour Party should play the petty games that Keir Starmer plays now and kick out, people because they have slightly dissenting views. I think the Labour Party has always fundamentally been a party that reflects the interests of capital, and that sometimes it is hijacked by the left for its proper purpose rather than the other way around. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear to me that Jeremy Corbyn could have done a series of things, one of them being, for example, mandatory reselection, in which MPs have to stand again in their seats before they stand at a general election internally to justify their candidacy at an election. And that was seriously on the table, and it was actually the leadership bottled it. And that has to be acknowledged. Something like that, a mechanism, a disciplinary mechanism like that, would have at least guaranteed a modicum of respect from Labour Party MPs who, as you have alluded to, Helena, were day after day routinely briefing against the leadership in the most damaging, toxic possible way, including helping with a false anti-Semitism scandal, a false epidemic of anti-Semitism. So, or with the impression of an epidemic of anti-Semitism. So yeah, one of the major flaws of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership is that he wasn't, can I say, Keir Starmer enough? All I mean by that is authoritarian enough, but for the left, which is to say asking for a modicum of respect and discipline from his own fucking MPs. And a related point, and this is why it's so unbelievably depressing that didn't happen. You do look back and you think, wow, that Labour Party had 500,000 members. Overwhelming number of them came in after 2015. So we can, I think, extrapolate from that. An overwhelming number of them were there to support a Jeremy Corbyn-led political agenda, broadly speaking. They might not have thought he was the second coming, but they were broadly there from the left or for the left. And yet, because of a lack of discipline of the party vanguard in other areas of the party, MPs in particular, everything slipped away. Now, again, I agree with you, Helena. We can't sit here and say, oh, he would have won the election if it were it not for that and were it not for hostile media. I think those things were instrumental factors. I don't know if they were decisive or sufficient. But the point there stands. And I think, yeah, I'd refer, I suppose, just to summarize everything, to a point I briefly made earlier. The Labour Party, if you look at the history of the Labour Party in its relatively short time of existence, 125 years, 126 years, it's more often than not the party of the Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer worldview. And there are these kind of aberrations, these moments of schism in which every 2 or 3 decades the left gets control again. So this is all unsurprising to me, I'm sorry to say. I know I sound a bit jaded today. I probably sound a bit jaded today, but yes, it's unsurprising.
You know what's interesting? I think that being slightly more of a Keir Starmer in terms of the kind of holding the whip hand within the party is certainly right, but there would have been more of a reason to do it, right? Because fundamentally, whilst Keir Starmer is just purging people for not agreeing with the groupthink, the fundamental problem with the PLP and why a lot of them deserved to lose access to being the candidate for those specific seats was because of their desire to undermine not just the leadership, but the membership that supported that leader, right? That's fundamentally the point. Like, no one is going to complain about having a diversity of opinions in the party unless that is specifically being used to try and undermine what the membership have specifically voted for in the leader himself, Jeremy Corbyn, and the platform that he was putting forward, right? Like, this was the whole thing, is that the PLP told the membership, no, you're wrong. You can't have Jeremy Corbyn as leader. You can't have these left-wing policies as part of the policy prospectus, even though they voted on conference. We refuse to let you. We will force Jeremy Corbyn to go through another leadership election. We will do the referendum again. You will choose differently this time. And the membership rejected Owen Smith, just like they rejected Andy Burnham, Yvette Cooper, and Liz Kendall the first time round. It was fundamental that the PLP were in essentially a wrecking campaign, not just against the broad Labour Party, but the members that it represented, which is fundamentally the base of the Labour Party. They are the ones who fund the election campaigns. They're the ones who drive the movement. They're the ones pounding the pavement on the doorsteps to get Labour elected as the face of the Labour movement. And that's why the PLP fundamentally needed to get a little bit of the Keir Starmer treatment from Jeremy Corbyn, is because they were disloyal to the people who were there to actually get Labour elected and the ones who are out there putting these people into their almost 6-figure funded careers in government. And that is what is unforgivable. To talk about disunity when the PLP were fundamentally opposed to the membership that they are supposed to represent, right? That's how democracy works. Democracy is about representing the people, not the other way around. And they fundamentally failed in that prospectus. And they fundamentally are the real reason as to why the Labour Party was disunited from 2015 to 2019. Now, it's been a fortnight since Kieran Andrieu found himself captured by the Israeli state as part of the intercepted Global Summit flotilla. Here's the last we saw of him before he was kidnapped by the Middle East's most rogue nation.
So, we are being encircled. We're being encircled by this one vehicle, this large vehicle. Hard to give you a sense of how big and imposing it is. It's coming round my side now. What are we doing? Say hands up. Hands up, hands up. Hands up, everybody. Can you put your fucking hands up, please? Hands up, every last person. Okay, phones on the water, please. Phones on the water.
After that, Kieran was taken to Israel. You can read about what happened there in a new article by Kieran up on novaramedia.com, where he recounts being sent to the same prison that tortured his younger Palestinian brother Ahmed and stole his childhood. The link to that article is in the description below, but I'll just read you a few parts from it. This is how Kieran describes what happened to him after being abducted by Israeli soldiers. First, we were kidnapped by the IDF in international waters. Then we were brought to the port of Ashdod, cable-tied and forced to kneel for several hours. Finally, we were processed and packed onto prison buses and driven 2 hours through the night to a prison in the middle of nowhere. We were stripped of our clothes, forced into prison uniforms, and taken to our cells just as dawn was breaking. Many hours and no clean water or essential medicine later, I was dragged out of my cell into the infernal daylight. The British Consular General was here to see me, apparently. Where are we? I asked him weakly. He gave a sideways glance, anxious that the Israeli guards should not overhear him. We're in the Negev desert, he whispered, in Ketziot prison. It was only later that Kieran made the connection to his brother Ahmed and the torture he had undergone. Here's how he describes it in that piece. Ahmed was first kidnapped and locked up by Israel sometime after the Second Intifada in 2000. Disgusted at the bulldozing of a neighbouring Palestinian village, he and some friends fashioned slingshots, gathered rocks, and faced down the tanks. I was born 2 years before my brother, in a cosy town on the south coast of England. We share a Palestinian father, but have different mothers. His is Palestinian, mine is French. Even now, it is unclear to me exactly what has happened to my brother over the past 20-odd years. He has spent more of his teenage and adult life in Israeli prisons than out of them, and when he's out, he's beset by mental health problems induced by extreme trauma. I now have been to Palestine several times to meet and spend time with my dad's family, but I have yet to meet Ahmed because every time I go, he's locked up, a victim of Israel's insatiable prisoner industrial complex. Kieran, you described two deeply affecting experiences in that piece, both your brother Ahmed's and yours. How have you been since you were released by a terror state last week?
Well, I don't want to sound flippant after you read those extracts, but I hadn't seen the footage of the final moments before I disposed of the phone into the sea. And there's a mixture of, I suppose, I felt pretty, I felt quite an intense aversion to watching it, actually. But I think it's important that I do. I also understand that my saying, put your effing hands up, did the rounds. People thought it was an IDF soldier. We had been very, very carefully trained to make sure that we were non-violent and also de-escalatory in everything that we did. So just to explain, people putting their hands up was a pretty important part of the protocol. At that point, we already had guns pointed at us. We just didn't want to give them any excuse whatsoever. How am I feeling? I haven't really stopped, to be honest, Helena. I wanted, first of all, to do things to get as many of our comrades out of Ketziot prison as possible initially when I first got back and people were still locked up. There was, not of course, it's probably not clear to people or clear to everyone. There was a second wave of boats that arrived shortly after us under the umbrella 1,000 Madeleines. And they were then, of course, they went through the same process as us, basically speaking. And so they were locked up, and there were still a few people left over from my cohort from the Global Summit flotilla. I wanted to keep doing as many media things as possible, particularly mainstream media, if I could get it, to keep focus and keep pressure on, basically. And it just felt like the right thing to do as well. I mean, I didn't want to get out of prison and then start feasting and sleeping well while there were still people I knew, and in some cases were in a cell with, locked up. Everybody's now been released, I think, which is great. But I haven't really quit. I haven't really stopped. I've got things on all this week, and then I am going to take a week or two off. And so I suppose I'll be better placed to answer your question with more substance then. But right now I'm feeling fine. I feel fine. Maybe there's a delayed reaction on its way.
Now let's go to some audience questions. First, we've got a question from David here. Thank you for your question. Did you see any glimmers of human feeling in the Israeli military that you encountered?
Oh, what a brilliant question. I saw glimmers of human feeling, but it wasn't empathy. It wasn't empathy or compassion. I saw fear. I saw quite a lot of fear, which of course is a very human emotion. I'll give you one example. One of the S-13 elite naval unit soldiers noticed at one point that I had clocked eyes with him. And when we were being transported to the port of Ashdod, we were locked up in little rooms on our boat, but the doors were open. They were guarding us with guns as we were being transferred after inception. And, you know, it was about 15, 16, maybe 17 hours. So at first, standards are very high. I say that, but they were doing all sorts of comical things. But standards are supposed to be pretty high to begin with. And you know, they had their masks on and they have their guns and everything's very kind of rigorous, and we're packed off to our rooms. And then after a while, I noticed that one of the guys had taken his mask off, and he saw me. He saw that I saw that, and he looked pretty scared. And he quickly replaced his mask over his face, and before doing so, looked a mixture of scared and, I suppose, embarrassed, slightly embarrassed. In terms of human compassion, was there any kind of big Hollywoody moment where a guard whispered to me something about how they didn't want to be there or anything like that? I'm sorry to say there wasn't that. The Israeli I won't say the professional class, but the Israeli workers that I encountered, so the police officers at Ashdod, the prison guards, the ones that I spoke to, and I did actually, believe it or not, speak to a few of them, police officers in particular, as we were being processed through Ashdod. They seem to be divided into two cohorts. And I actually think that those cohorts are broadly reflective of wider Israeli public sentiment. Those who think that genocide and ethnic cleansing is the only option for Palestinians and the right option, and those who dream of returning to the kind of liberal Zionist fantasy of a kind of Palestinian underclass that's passive and ruled by its Zionist superiors. And beyond that, I didn't encounter anything. I have to be honest. Those were the two kind of streams of opinion reflected in personalities that I encountered.
Got another question here from Laurel Beach. What do you think happened to the aid that was on the ship that Ben Gvir toured on camera? Did you all expect Israel to claim that there wasn't any aid?
I didn't actually think about what Israel would claim. I didn't think specifically around the aid what they would claim. I don't know what's happened to the aid. The organization Global Flotilla doesn't know what happened to the aid. I think we can assume that they got it off the boats as quickly as they could so that they could hide it or destroy it, more likely. Maybe some of it was taken for consumption. I don't know. My assumption is that they destroyed it, actually. Unfortunately. They're claiming that the fact of their claiming that there wasn't any aid on the boats, I didn't really anticipate that. But if I'd thought about it in any depth, I think I would have. That's what Israel does, isn't it? Right? It discredits its opponents by saying that they're Hamas, Tick, it did that to us. It discredits them by making them appear frivolous. Tick, selfie yacht, although it has to be said they lent far more into the Hamas strategy than or terror-linked strategy than the selfie yacht strategy this time round, which was pretty intimidating. But anyway, so tick, tick. And then, they also try and make people look like liars. When obviously, what's the phrase? Every accusation is a confession. They are obviously the world's biggest pathological systemic liars. So it makes sense to me that they would say they came here for X, Y, and Z be that our central claim, which is that central mission objective, which is that we're bringing aid, was false. It makes perfect sense to me. It's of a piece with Israeli lies and Israeli strategy that they would claim that.
Imagine having someone who's a bigger liar than Keir Starmer. I'm going to go to a question from Jeremy Adu, who asks, how much do you think the flotilla contributed to the peace deal that Trump put forward?
I love your way of thinking, but I don't think it contributed at all to the peace deal. I don't think it contributed to the peace deal at all. And I think that and I'm not suggesting that the person who asked that question thinks this at all, but I don't think that the peace deal really contributes to the peace deal. I think the peace deal is largely a sham, unfortunately. But yeah, I don't think that our flotilla did that. I know that people on the US delegation were being told by pretty credible sources, and were told when they got out, including friends of this show, David Adler, for example, that the US government was actively working to obstruct their own citizens being released from illegal false detention. I would be astonished if the flotilla fed into any of that process at all. It did have some political wins. It definitely did have some political wins, and I think they're really worth very briefly enumerating and emphasizing. First of all, I understand that some people in Gaza were able to fish the waters in their own seas, and eat for 1 or 2 nights because we kept the bastards busy. That's not nothing. That's something of value in itself. I mean, we always knew when we were going on the flotilla that nothing we were going to do would be commensurate to the scale of the challenge. Obviously, it was a civil mission. It didn't have the resources of a government, and that's the point, that institutions failed. So ordinary, ramshackle, chaotic activists, journalists, doctors, etc., stepped up to try and fill that vacuum. So, of course, it was always going to be insufficient. But again, I return to the point. The fact that some people are able to fish and eat the fish in their waters that belongs to them is, to me, immensely moving and significant, has value in itself. Second of all, the larger kind of IR, international relations or geopolitical stuff, I think it's really significant. I really do. That pressure, civil society, bottom-up pressure in Italy, in Spain, particularly in Italy, because they were trying to corral a fascist government, right, in Meloni's government, that pressure from the bottom up compelled the governments in Italy and Spain that they had to put naval vessels on the Mediterranean to protect us. I think that's really, really significant. And lo and behold, the drone bombings of our boats stopped the day that the Italian frigate vessel joined the flotilla, and we could see it from the flotilla. So it was near enough. And people can say, oh, well, it's Meloni. There are all sorts of other motivations. Of course there were. Of course there were. We're not naive. I'm not naive about that. But fundamentally speaking, that happened because huge sections of Italian civil society closed down parts of the economy. And because of the way that Italian unions are organized and the sort of pro-Palestine civil society sentiment feeding into those unions, it was very effective. That then fed up and forced the Italian government, no doubt by hook and crook, to put naval frigates on the Mediterranean, which is significant. Why? Because Israel, as well as torturing the Palestinians and destroying Palestine, it also pushes the envelope of international norms and international law. And it violates other countries' territorial sovereignty. And it kills other countries' citizens. Obviously, nowhere near on the scale that it kills Palestinians, but it does do that as well. And it locks them up. And so for Israel, which only understands the flexing of military muscle, right? Let's be honest, it only understands that. For Israel to have pushback from countries in NATO was really significant. And if only we can keep up that momentum and translate it to other countries with governments that might ordinarily not want to act, then we might really be onto something. I think we're a way away from that. But the fact that the flotilla animated that shift in gears in the relations between Israel and NATO countries is something really significant. And I think we should take it as a political win.
Got a couple more questions just quickly whilst we've got time. I'm going to go to Yasmin's question here, which is that what is the role of Turkey in your return home? Or what was the role of Turkey in your return home? And any clarity on the role of the Turkish Navy ship? Is it false hope that Turkey can have a positive influence in the so-called peace deal?
Turkey was very surreptitious, very secretive about what its naval vessel was doing. And actually, I mean, we saw it, but it was pretty difficult to discern Turkish motives at that point. Nonetheless, again, it was keeping us. It kept us safe. You know, I had discussions with people on the boats about this, and they didn't feel entirely comfortable. And I get it. We don't want to. Nobody needs to say thank you, Meloni, thank you, Erdogan. We shouldn't say that. We should say thank you, the people of Italy, thank you, the people of Turkey, for having a broad-based pro-Palestine civil society that's active in trade unions and so on. Not in Turkey, in Italy. Once we left, so that's to answer in reverse order. Now to go to the first part of the question. When we left, we were it was very clear that Turkey wanted to treat us like demigods, actually. And they put on it's the best plain food I've ever had. We were flown out of Eilat airport in the south of Israel by Turkish Airlines. And we were taken to Istanbul, and on that flight we were fed very well, and then they announced that they were going to put us in kafirs if we wanted them, because we were all still wearing our Israeli prison clothes. And obviously, I mean, you'd have to have been born yesterday to not realize that there's some geopolitics going on here. There's some jockeying, there's some Erdogan or the Turkish government, but apparently Erdogan was very close to it. So it is not overshooting to say Erdogan directly was using us as pawns in some kind of game whose exact nature is still not entirely clear to me, against Israel. Regional maneuvering, power, jockeying, soft power, accumulation, whatever you want to call it. Something's going on. Something was going on, and something is still going on. We were very aware that we were being used as pawns at that point. I have to say, though, I mean, we were being treated like lower than dogs when we were in Israel. So to suddenly be airlifted and treated like demigods, it was quite agreeable. And we weren't pushed into doing anything we didn't want to do. The Turks wanted to send us to doctors so that we could be tested. Some people did, some people didn't. Some people refused. I refused. But they also wanted to take legal briefing from us, legal accounts, so that they could build a case against Israel. I complied with that and I did it. But it was clear to me that if I didn't want to, I wouldn't be forced to. So I think, all criticism of Erdogan and Erdogan's regime stands. And, we've talked about it before on the show. We'll talk about it again. But I can't help but feel that, strategically speaking, the space around Israel closing is a good thing. And Turkey is a regional power. There is no denying that Turkey is a regional power. It's a very significant regional power. And there's a reason that Israel bombs Syria and Lebanon willy-nilly and doesn't go anywhere near Turkey.
And finally, I've got a question from Lucy Goosey, who asks, what kept you going when you had to be away from your comrades or were isolated completely? And what thoughts gave you the most strength?
for a lot of it, I was with people. So I was never isolated, really. Either I was arranged among 300 other flotilla activists on my knees with my hands tied behind my back, very bleak, in silence, but we were there. I could still see everybody. Or I was being processed through the port of Ashdod, and I could see everybody. I could see people I'd been on the boats with. I could see Greta. I could see other people. And we could communicate with each other through facial expression, at least in that scenario. Then I was transferred onto a bus with about seven other people from my flotilla, some of which had been on my boat. All of this was very, very bleak. I mean, our hands were tied, mine so tightly I was worried my fingers were going to drop off. It was horrible. We didn't know where we were going. Some people had been blindfolded. But we were with people. I was always with people. I got to the prison. I was in a cage with 100 other people from the flotilla. I was then transferred to cells. I was in a cell with 9 other people from the flotilla. And the reason I say all of this is not to exonerate Israel and say, oh, very kind of Israel, they were putting me with people. No, they had to do that for their own clerical purposes, their own logistical purposes. It was that the solidarity was the lifesaver. It really, really was the lifesaver. And particularly in the cell, I was in the cell for a day and a half with the same people. We really saved each other. I mean, I don't want to be melodramatic, but we kept each other going. We really did. And we also managed to shift the power dynamic. Initially, we were all very nervous, frightened of the guards. But as the day wore on, and one day in that place felt like a week, by the way. I mean, genuinely felt like a week. We managed to shift the power dynamic, and we were much more vocal, shall I say, with the guards. And that kind of solidarity, that kind of camaraderie really, really saved the day. Without that, had I been put in solitary confinement, and I thought at one point I was going to be, that was probably the only moment where I genuinely felt fear. I have to say, honestly, the more I hate something, the less frightened I am of it. Tends to be the case. Because I hate Israel more or less, more than I've ever hated anything in my life. It follows logically that I wasn't that frightened for most of it. But I was frightened when I thought I was going to be transferred to a cell on my own for precisely the reason that you allude to, Lucy, which is that it would have been terrifying to be rattling around with only my thoughts in my head, only the thoughts in my head in a cell on my own. It would have been really terrifying. Unfortunately, I never faced that.
Thank you very much for joining me, Kieran, this evening. It's an absolute pleasure.
It's fantastic to be back. I'm a bit weary, but thank you so much for having me, Helena. Great to co-host with you as ever.
Now, thank you everyone at home for tuning in tonight too. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.